It was a beautiful, sunny day in the garden, where Peppa and her friends were playing happily together. George was there with his favorite dinosaur, Susie Sheep was laughing, and Pedro Pony was adjusting his glasses. Everything seemed perfect in their innocent world. But then, a mysterious figure appeared at the edge of their playground. A tall man in a black suit, with a strange geometric mask, approached them slowly. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere, though the children didn't understand why they suddenly felt uneasy. The stranger introduced himself as Mr. Organizer and spoke in a calm, unsettling voice. He offered them a chance to play a very special game, promising incredible prizes that would make them the happiest children in the world. The children's eyes lit up with excitement, but their parents, watching from nearby, looked deeply concerned. Something about this stranger felt wrong, terribly wrong. Soon, helpers in bright pink suits with triangle symbols on their masks appeared from nowhere, surrounding the playground like silent sentinels. The first game began innocently enough. Red light, green light. The children ran and froze, laughed and played, not knowing they were entering a nightmare. But when little George moved during a red light, one of the pink guards approached him menacingly. In an instant, George simply vanished, leaving only empty space where he had been standing. The other children screamed in horror, but the game continued relentlessly. Peppa's eyes widened with growing terror as she began to understand that this was no ordinary game. The second game was tug of war, and teams were formed by force, not choice. During the struggle, Susie Sheep fell and disappeared just like George, leaving Peppa screaming silently with no sound coming from her mouth. When Peppa tried to run away, the pink guards blocked every exit, trapping her in this twisted playground. Mr. Organizer's voice echoed coldly, "The game must continue. These are the rules." Only Peppa and Pedro remained for the final game, tic-tac-toe. Peppa won, but the victory felt hollow and horrifying as she realized the true cost. Then Mr. Organizer slowly removed his mask, revealing the shocking truth. It was Daddy Pig, but his eyes were completely empty. Black voids where warmth once lived. Peppa woke up in her own bedroom, gasping and confused, but when she looked at the photos on her wall, all her friends had vanished from every picture, as if they had never existed. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her movements were mechanical and robotic, like a wind-up toy that had lost its soul. When Peppa looked in the bathroom mirror, she saw her own reflection, staring back with the same empty black eyes as Daddy Pig. A slow, creepy smile spread across her face as she turned toward the viewer and whispered the final chilling words. "Do you want to play?" An ordinary morning in Peppa Pig's family home. Everyone sits at breakfast laughing and enjoying family happiness. Daddy Pig comes home from work looking devastated. He holds a termination letter in his hands. "I don't need to come to work anymore," he says in a trembling voice. The family gathers for a serious conversation. Daddy Pig explains the financial problems. "We have no more money in our accounts," he admits. The postman brings a stack of bills and notices. Mummy Pig opens them one by one, her face becoming increasingly worried. The family watches television when a bright advertisement appears. "Perfect Life Solutions, the answer to all your financial problems," promises the announcer's voice. There's a knock at the door. Daddy Pig opens it and sees a mysterious figure in a business suit and mask. "I represent Perfect Life Solutions. We can help your family," says the stranger in a cold voice. Daddy Pig signs the contract without reading the fine print. "Now all your problems are solved," the agent assures. Money arrives in the family's bank account. Everyone rejoices and hugs. Agents bring new documents with additional conditions. The requirements become increasingly strange and intrusive. Several masked agents enter the house and begin appraising all property. The family watches with growing discomfort. Agents bring red documents with even harsher requirements. "You owe more than you received," explains the agent. The family is shocked. Daddy Pig tries to cancel the contract, but the agents refuse. The agreement cannot be terminated, they say. "You are bound to us forever. Agents begin removing furniture and belongings from the house. The family helplessly watches as their home is emptied. Mummy Pig becomes distant and emotionless. She no longer responds to Peppa's questions. Daddy Pig sits alone in an empty room, completely broken. Depression has consumed him completely. Agents force the family to participate in strange games and trials. This is your chance to pay off the debt, they explain. Peppa looks at her parents and realizes the terrible truth. Adults can no longer protect her. Agents announce the complete seizure of the house. The family must leave their home forever. The family is faced with an impossible choice: which family member to exclude from the program. Peppa runs around the neighborhood trying to find help, but all adults are either under agent control or too frightened to intervene. The house is completely empty. Each family member is led away in different directions under agent escort. The family is destroyed. Peppa remains alone in empty space, but a spark of hope still burns in her eyes. Despite all losses, she doesn't give up and believes that someday the family will reunite. Morning in Peppa Pig's house began as usual. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast. Peppa and George came downstairs, ready for a new day. Daddy Pig was already sitting at the table, reading a newspaper. Mummy Pig places plates with pancakes on the table. Everyone smiles, but a subtle shadow flickers on Daddy Pig's face. He puts down the newspaper. His gaze seems distant. Peppa tries to talk to Daddy Pig, asking about his day. He answers monosyllabically, without looking up. His movements become slow, almost robotic. George offers Daddy Pig to play. He just nods but doesn't move. His eyes seem empty, and his smile is frozen. Mummy Pig looks at Daddy Pig with concern. She touches his forehead, but he doesn't react. A cold, unnatural silence fills the kitchen. Peppa and George begin to feel uncomfortable. They exchange glances, trying to understand what is happening. The atmosphere becomes tense. Daddy Pig gets up from the table. His steps are heavy. He walks to the window. Outside the window is an ordinary landscape, but something ominous is reflected in his eyes. Mummy Pig tries to hug him, but he pulls away. His gaze becomes even more distant, almost alien. Peppa remembers recent news about strange disappearances in the city. She feels a chill run down her spine. Daddy Pig begins to mumble something inaudible. His voice is low and hoarse, unlike his usual voice. George hides behind Mummy Pig. He is scared. Mummy Pig tries to calm him down, but she herself looks frightened. Daddy Pig turns to them. His eyes appear as black voids. He slowly extends a hand towards Peppa. Peppa recoils. She sees something in his eyes that does not belong to her father. It is something ancient and evil. Mummy Pig screams. She tries to push Daddy Pig away, but he is too strong. His grip is steel. George cries. He doesn't understand what's happening, but he feels danger. His tears stream down his cheeks. Daddy Pig begins to laugh. His laugh is inhuman. It echoes through the house. The laugh is filled with madness. Suddenly, Daddy Pig freezes. His body begins to tremble. Black smoke erupts from his mouth. The smoke envelops him, and he falls to the floor. When the smoke clears, an ordinary Daddy Pig lies in his place, but his eyes are closed. Mummy Pig rushes to him. She tries to wake him up, but he is unconscious. There are no traces of what happened on his face. Peppa and George look at him. They know something happened, but they can't explain. Fear remains in their eyes. Mummy Pig calls an ambulance. She holds Daddy Pig's hand, her face full of anxiety. Something has changed forever. Peppa looks out the window. The world seems ordinary, but she knows that something dark. Today we'll have a new teacher at kindergarten. Peppa and George are having breakfast at home at the kitchen table. Peppa excitedly shares the news. "I wonder what he's like," Children are playing on the kindergarten playground. Susie curiously asks Peppa about the new teacher. "Hello, children. I will conduct special games with you." The sinister frontman, in a black suit and geometric mask, enters the classroom. Children look at him with surprise. "Anyone who cannot stand still will leave us." Children stand in a circle. Frontman explains the rules of the first game. The atmosphere becomes tense. "I just wanted to scratch." Pedro Pony sadly makes excuses as he leaves the group of children after moving during the game. Where is Pedro? Why hasn't he returned? Peppa worriedly looks at the empty chair where Pedro used to sit, beginning to understand something is wrong. Movement on red means elimination. A red light, green light game takes place on the playground. Frontman strictly observes the children. "But I don't understand the rules." Rebecca Rabbit, in a yellow dress, moves confusedly and leaves the game, not understanding what's happening. Dinosaur, scary. Little George fearfully hides behind Peppa's back, sensing the threat from what's happening. Why is everyone so quiet? Peppa notices that the remaining children stand silently with empty gazes. Their behavior has drastically changed. The next game begins. Guards in pink suits with black circle masks enter the classroom, announcing a new trial. Games are more important than friendship. Susie Sheep looks with an empty, detached gaze, her personality completely changed under the influence of the games. What's happening to my friends? Peppa and George remain alone in the nearly empty classroom, surrounded by empty chairs of disappeared friends. Final game. Winner takes all. Frontman stands in the center of the darkened classroom, announcing the final trial to the few remaining children. "I won't play these games." Peppa resolutely refuses to participate, demonstrating strength of character and defending her principles. True friendship isn't a competition. Peppa firmly holds George's hand, showing that family bonds are more important than any games. "Peppa, help!" Multiple pink guards surround Peppa and George. The morning in Peppa Pig's house began as usual. Sunbeams pierced through the curtains, and breakfast was already waiting on the table. Daddy Pig read the newspaper, Mummy Pig cooked pancakes, and Peppa and George played with their toys. Everything was familiar and calm. Peppa, as always, tried to teach George how to properly stack blocks, but he only giggled and scattered them across the floor. Mummy Pig smiled watching them, and Daddy Pig only occasionally looked up from his newspaper to take a sip of tea. It was a perfect morning, filled with warmth and comfort, foreshadowing an ordinary day full of games and fun. However, something changed. Elusively, barely noticeably, Daddy Pig stopped laughing at his own jokes. His gaze became detached, empty. He could sit for hours staring at a single point, not reacting to questions. Peppa noticed it first. Daddy Pig, who was always ready to play or toss her high in the air, now only looked through her indifferently. She tried to get his attention, telling him about her games with Susie Sheep, but he didn't listen. His eyes were open, but it seemed he didn't see. One day, when Peppa tried to hug him, he pulled away as if not recognizing her. It was very painful, and Peppa didn't understand what was happening. She felt lonely, even though Daddy Pig was nearby. His presence became cold and alien. Mummy Pig also began to change. She became more irritable, often snapping at Peppa and George over trifles. Her voice, usually so soft and gentle, now sounded sharp and abrupt. She stopped baking pancakes in the mornings, and the house filled with the smell of something else, something metallic and unpleasant. Peppa saw Mummy Pig spend hours in front of the mirror, staring intently at her reflection as if trying to find something that had disappeared. Her smile became strained and her eyes empty like Daddy Pig's. She became obsessed with order, constantly cleaning and rearranging things, even those that were already in their places. One day, Peppa woke up in the middle of the night. Moonlight flooded the room. George slept on the bottom bunk, and Peppa lay on top. She heard strange sounds from the living room, quiet, monotonous voices, as if someone was whispering something. She carefully got out of bed and quietly went towards the sound. The morning at Peppa Pig's house began as usual. The sun shone on the bunk beds where Peppa and George slept. Breakfast was full of laughter and normal family conversations. Everything was as it should be in a happy pig family. But something changed when a new neighbor, Mr. Octopus, appeared on the doorstep. He was unusually polite, but there was something disturbing in his eyes. He invited the pig family for tea. At tea, Mr. Octopus told stories about the strange games he had played and how they changed people. His voice was hypnotic, and Peppa noticed how Daddy Pig became unusually thoughtful, and Mummy Pig began to fidget with the hem of her apron. The next day, Daddy Pig was different. He stopped laughing, his eyes became distant, and his usual cheerfulness disappeared. He spent hours sitting by the window staring into space and refusing his favorite chocolate cake. Mummy Pig tried to talk to him, but he just waved her off. Peppa and George sensed that something was wrong. One night, Peppa was woken by a strange sound. She looked down at George's bed, but he was not there. Peppa's heart began to beat faster. She crept down the stairs and saw that the door to her parents' room was ajar. Muffled voices were coming from inside. Peppa peered inside cautiously. Daddy Pig and Mummy Pig were standing in the middle of the room, their faces pale and tense. Mr. Octopus stood between them, his tentacles swaying slowly in the air. He was whispering something, and his words seemed to penetrate their minds. Daddy Pig's eyes were empty, and Mummy Pig was slowly reaching out to Mr. Octopus, as if she were hypnotized. Peppa was scared. She wanted to scream, but her voice was stuck in her throat. She saw George, standing next to Mr. Octopus, slowly turn towards her. His eyes were as empty as Daddy Pig's. He held out his small hand to her, and Peppa felt a chill run down her spine. She flinched back, and George took a step forward. Mr. Octopus smiled, and his smile was cold and lifeless. Peppa knew that her family had changed, and that the change was irreversible. She ran out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where to run, but she knew she had to run as far away from this house, from this family that was no longer her family. There was an unusual buzz on the playground. The children gathered around a new mysterious figure, a tall, thin doll with large, unmoving eyes. This was the doll overseer, and she brought a new game, red light, green light. The rules were simple. When the doll overseer said green light, you could move. When she said red light, everyone had to freeze. Anyone who moved when they shouldn't was out of the game. At first, it was all fun. The children laughed, ran, and froze. But then Peppa noticed something was wrong. When someone was out, they didn't just go home, they disappeared without a trace. Freddy Fox was the first to vanish. He was always restless, and this time, unable to resist, he moved on red light. The doll overseer turned her head. Her eyes flashed a dull red light, and Freddy simply dissolved into thin air. No one but Peppa seemed to notice. Everyone else was too engrossed in the game. Peppa tried to warn Susie Sheep, but she just brushed her off, her gaze fixed on the doll overseer. "Don't distract me, Peppa. This is an important game," Susie said, her voice unusually sharp. Gradually, others disappeared too. Rebecca Rabbit, Danny Dog. Every time someone broke the rules, the doll overseer took them, and no one remembered them, as if they had never existed. In the evening, when George was already asleep on the bottom bunk of the bunk bed and Peppa was lying on top, she quietly whispered, "George, they're disappearing. Everyone who loses just disappears." George mumbled something sleepily in response, but Peppa knew he felt it too. She remembered the doll overseer's cold, emotionless voice, her unmoving eyes that seemed to see everything. This was not just a game, it was a trap, and Peppa didn't know how to stop it before all her friends disappeared, and she herself became the next. One day, as Peppa and George played hide-and-seek in the garden, George hid behind an old, long-forgotten well. The well was covered in moss and lichen, and its wooden lid barely held on. When Peppa approached it to find George, she heard a quiet, melodic chime coming from its depths. Curiosity took over, and Peppa carefully opened the lid. A chill emanated from the well, and the chime grew louder, turning into an enchanting melody. Peppa peered inside, but saw only pitch darkness. Suddenly, a small, shiny bell flew out from the depths of the well. It spun in the air, emitting the same melody, and then landed directly in Peppa's hand. As soon as the bell touched her palm, Peppa felt a strange numbness. Her laughter faded, and her eyes became empty. She no longer wanted to play. She just stood by the well, holding the bell, and staring into nothingness. George, emerging from his hiding place, saw Peppa. He tried to call her, but she didn't respond. He approached her, and the bell in her hand emitted another melodic chime. George felt the same numbness. His eyes also became empty. They both stood by the well, holding the bell and staring into nothingness. The parents, returning home, did not immediately notice the changes. They were glad that the children were playing so quietly. But when they tried to talk to them, Peppa and George did not answer. They just looked at them with empty eyes. At night, when everyone went to bed, Peppa and George quietly got out of their beds. In their room was a bunk bed. George slept on the bottom and Peppa on the top. They went to the window and looked at the well. It glowed in the dark with a dim, alluring light. The next morning, all the children who had heard the bell's chime became the same. They sat on the grass and silently stared at the well. Their parents were desperate. They tried to cheer up the children, but nothing helped. Then they decided to fill in the well. But when they approached it, a tall man in a mask and a pink jumpsuit came out from behind the well. He silently blocked their way. The parents were frightened and retreated. They realized that this was not just a well. This was something else, something that takes away children's souls, and they could do nothing about it. In the dim light of dawn, before the dew had evaporated from the grass, Peppa and George sat at the kitchen table. Breakfast was ordinary, oatmeal with berries, but something hung in the air. Mummy Pig, usually so cheerful, silently poured tea, her gaze fixed on the window. Daddy Pig, usually loud and jovial, only grunted occasionally, buried in his newspaper. The mood was heavy, like a lead blanket. Peppa tried to talk about the upcoming game of hide-and-seek with Susie Sheep, but her words dissolved into the silence. George, usually restless, quietly ate his oatmeal, not uttering a sound. His eyes, usually full of mischief, seemed empty. Later in the day, as the sun rose higher, Peppa went to Susie's house. Mummy Sheep opened the door, her face pale. "Susie can't play today, Peppa," she whispered, avoiding direct eye contact. Her voice trembled. Peppa felt a chill run down her spine. She returned home, where Mummy Pig still sat by the window, and Daddy Pig had not yet looked up from his newspaper. George sat on the bottom bunk of the bunk bed, staring at the ceiling. Peppa climbed onto her top bunk, trying to understand what was happening. She heard her parents quietly talking in the kitchen, their voices filled with worry. The words changed and, not like before, reached her. The next day, things got even worse. Mummy Pig began repeating the same phrases, her movements becoming mechanical. Daddy Pig stopped reading his newspaper, his gaze as empty as George's. They moved around the house like puppets, performing routine actions without any emotion. Peppa tried to get their attention, asked questions, but received only indifferent stares in response. She approached George, who was still sitting on his bunk. "George, what happened?" she asked, but he only slowly turned his head, his eyes black as bottomless wells. A strange, low sound escaped his mouth, making Peppa recoil. It wasn't George. It was something else, something that had taken his place. Peppa ran out of the room, her heart pounding. She saw Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig standing in the middle of the living room, their bodies swaying slightly. They looked at her, but there was no recognition in their eyes. These were not her parents. They were shells, empty vessels. She tried to open the front door, but the handle wouldn't budge. The house had become a trap. The sound George made repeated, but now it came from all directions, filling every corner of the house. Peppa huddled in a corner, closing her eyes. She felt a cold shadow approaching, enveloping her. The last thing she heard was a whisper that seemed to come from within her own mind. "Now you are one of us." A sunny day. Peppa and George are playing in the garden. Suddenly, all sounds vanish. Birds stop singing. The wind doesn't rustle the leaves. A complete, unnatural silence. Peppa tries to call George, but her voice makes no sound. George also tries to speak, but his mouth only opens and closes silently. They look at each other in bewilderment. They run into the house. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig are sitting in the living room watching TV. The screen flickers, but there's no sound. They don't notice Peppa and George, their gazes fixed on the silent image. Peppa tries to get their attention, waving her hands, jumping, but they don't react. Their faces are calm, but their eyes are empty, as if they see something Peppa and George don't. Peppa and George run outside. All the pigs in the city are moving, but silently. Children play in the park, but their laughter is unheard. Cars drive on the roads, but there's no engine noise. It's not just silence. It's the absence of sound, as if the world has become a silent film. Peppa sees Susie Sheep, silently laughing, looking at something invisible. Her laughter looks eerie without sound. Peppa and George try to find someone who can hear them. They run to Grandpa Pig's house. The door is open. Grandpa Pig is sitting on the porch, his lips moving silently, as if he's telling a story. His eyes are empty, but a strange, blissful smile plays on his face. He points to the sky. Peppa and George look up. There's nothing there, just a clear blue sky. But Grandpa Pig keeps pointing, his smile widening. Peppa feels the silence beginning to seep into her. Her own thoughts become soundless. She tries to remember the sound of her parents' voices, George's laughter, but there's only emptiness in her memory. She looks at George. His eyes also begin to lose their sparkle. He slowly raises his hand and points to the sky, just like Grandpa Pig. The same blissful smile appears on his face. Peppa feels her lips stretch into the same smile. Her gaze fixes on the sky, and she hears nothing more, not even her own soundless thoughts. Only blissful silence. It was a sunny day, just like any other. Peppa and George were playing in the garden, their laughter echoing throughout the neighborhood. Mummy Pig was hanging out the laundry, humming a cheerful tune while Daddy Pig was watering the garden, grunting contentedly. Everything was perfect until lunchtime came around. At the table, George, usually so hungry, was just poking at his plate with his fork. His gaze was fixed on something invisible outside the window. Peppa tried to ask what was wrong, but he just waved her away, his movements sharp and unnatural. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig exchanged worried glances. This was the beginning of something new. Something that disrupted the normal course of their lives. In the evening, as Peppa and George were getting ready for bed, George, who slept on the bottom bunk of the bunk bed, began to mutter quietly. His words were indistinct, but they contained strange, repetitive sounds. Peppa, lying on the top bunk, listened. The muttering grew louder, turning into a monotonous, rhythmic chant. George sat staring into the darkness, his eyes glowing a dull red. Peppa called for her parents, but they did not come. The sound grew louder, filling the room, penetrating every corner. Peppa felt her own breathing become heavy, her heart beating in unison with this strange rhythm. She tried to cover her ears, but the sound was inside her, vibrating in her bones. The next day, George was different. He didn't respond to his name, his movements were slow, and his face showed complete indifference. He continued to sing monotonously, his voice low and deep, unlike little George's voice. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig tried to talk to him, but he couldn't hear them. They were desperate. Peppa watched him, feeling fear grip her. She saw his eyes, now completely red, slowly turning, following invisible objects. He was possessed by something none of them could understand. His singing became more and more obsessive, penetrating their consciousness and distorting reality. Soon, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig also began to change. Their movements became just as slow, their eyes taking on the same dull red hue. They joined George, chanting monotonously, their voices merging into a single eerie chorus. The house was filled with this sound. It became part of its walls, its furniture. Peppa was left alone, surrounded by her changed family. She tried to run away, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She felt her own body begin to vibrate in time with the singing. Her eyes began to turn red. The last thing she saw before the world plunged into a red mist were the faces of her family, distorted by indifference, and their red eyes which looked at her but did not see her. She became part of the choir, part of this strange, endless singing. A sunny day illuminated Peppa Pig's house. Peppa and George played in their room. George fiddled with his dinosaur on the bottom bunk, while Peppa, on the top, read a book. Mummy Pig cooked, Daddy Pig fixed a faucet. Everything was as always. But something hung in the air. Peppa put down her book and looked at George. He was quiet, gaze fixed on the wall. "George, are you okay?" Peppa asked, but he didn't answer. His small eyes seemed glassy. Smile barely flickered. Mummy Pig called them for lunch. At the table, George ate slowly, mechanically. Daddy Pig didn't notice. "George, why are you so quiet?" Mummy Pig asked, but George merely shrugged. His movements became stiff, voice sounded detached. The next day, Susie Sheep came to school. She noticed changes in George. He didn't want to play, didn't laugh. Susie tried to talk, but George turned away. "He's acting strange," Susie whispered to Peppa. Peppa felt growing unease. She tried to remember when George started behaving this way. It was gradual, almost imperceptible. First, he became less active. Then his gaze changed. Now he barely reacted. That evening, as Peppa and George lay in their beds, Peppa tried to talk again. "George, what's wrong?" she asked, leaning down from the top bunk. George slowly turned his head. His eyes were wide open, no trace of former childish joy. I don't know," he whispered, voice filled with strange emptiness. Peppa felt a chill. She looked at his dinosaur. The dinosaur also seemed different, its eyes gleaming in the dark. The next day, Mummy Pig noticed George didn't want to leave. He sat in his room staring at the wall. Daddy Pig tried to cheer him up, but George waved him off. "He's just tired," Daddy Pig said, but Mummy Pig felt that wasn't it. She went to George, tried to hug, but he pulled away. His skin was cold. Peppa watched, her heart tightening with fear. She saw her brother slowly disappearing, transforming into someone else. Soon, other characters began to change. Pedro Pony became serious, laughter gone. Rebecca Rabbit stopped jumping, preferring to sit alone. Their eyes, like George's, became empty, movements mechanical. One day, Peppa woke up in the middle of the night. She heard strange sounds from George's room. She carefully climbed down and went to his bed. George sat, staring into a mirror that used to hang in the living room. His reflection was distorted. It smiled a wide, unnatural smile. Peppa felt panic. She tried to call George, but no sound escaped her throat. The reflection reached out to George, and he slowly reached back. Peppa wanted to stop. The morning began with birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the curtains onto the bunk bed. Peppa stretched on the top bunk while George slept below, hugging his dinosaur. From the kitchen came the soft clinking of dishes. Daddy Pig hummed and Mummy Pig prepared breakfast. Peppa climbed down, her pink dress rustling. George, still sleepy, followed her. Breakfast was tasty as always, but Peppa noticed Mummy Pig adjusting her hair in the toaster's reflection and Daddy Pig spending too long smoothing his shirt. Odd, but Peppa didn't dwell on it. At school, Susie Sheep looked perfect, wearing a shiny new pendant like all the other girls. Peppa felt uneasy. During recess, the girls frequently paused to adjust their pendants in synchronized mechanical movements. When Peppa tried to join them, they gave distant smiles, their eyes oddly vacant. That evening, Peppa stared into the mirror, adjusting her ears to match Susie's. She made a foil pendant, but it wasn't as shiny. George approached with his dinosaur, inviting her to play, but Peppa waved him off, eyes locked on her reflection. For a moment, she thought she saw a tall, still figure with empty eyes behind her, but it vanished. The next day, Peppa asked Mummy Pig for a pendant like Susie's. Mummy was surprised, but agreed. Day by day, Peppa grew distant. She stopped laughing, no longer jumped in puddles, and barely played with George. Instead, she sat for hours in front of the mirror, rehearsing smiles and movements. Her eyes gleamed with a strange obsession. Mummy and Daddy Pig tried to talk to her, but Peppa answered in flat, rehearsed phrases. One night, George woke to hear Peppa whispering to the ceiling, eyes wide, unmoving. Scared, he hid under his blanket. At school, Peppa became the center of attention. All the girls mimicked her, speaking, moving in unison, pendants shining together. Peppa smiled, but it was empty. Watching from afar, George felt her slipping away. When he tried to approach, she turned away, staring past the schoolyard. In her eyes, he saw countless identical, faceless figures moving as one. That evening, Peppa went straight to the mirror. Her reflection slowly morphed, its features smooth and mannequin-like. George offered his dinosaur again. Peppa glanced at him, but didn't truly see him. Her reflection, nearly identical to the tall figure, held her gaze. The room was spotless. The mirror showed a perfect, lifeless space, and in its center stood what once was Peppa, her lips curled into a flawless, eerie smile. The mirror didn't break, but its reflection was forever changed. The morning began with birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the curtains. Peppa stretched on the top bunk, while George slept below, hugging his dinosaur. Familiar household sounds filled the house. Clinking dishes, Daddy Pig humming, Mummy Pig cooking. Peppa climbed down. George soon followed. Over breakfast, Peppa noticed her parents acting oddly. Mummy Pig kept fixing her hair in the hostess' reflection, and Daddy Pig fussed with his shirt. Peppa found it strange, but didn't dwell on it. At school, Susie Sheep looked flawless, wearing a shiny new pendant. All the girls had similar ones. During recess, Peppa saw them pausing to adjust their pendants in perfect sync, their smiles distant, eyes blank. When Peppa tried to join in, they ignored her. That evening, at home, Peppa stared in the mirror, adjusting her ears like Susie's. She made a foil pendant, but it wasn't shiny enough. George invited her to play, but she waved him off, fixated on her reflection. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a tall, still figure with empty eyes behind her, but it vanished. The next day, Peppa asked for a pendant like Susie's. Mummy Pig agreed, though surprised. Over time, Peppa grew distant. She stopped jumping in puddles, rarely played with George, and spent hours perfecting her smile in the mirror. Her eyes gleamed with a strange obsession. When spoken to, she replied with flat, rehearsed phrases. One night, George woke to hear Peppa whispering to herself, eyes wide, staring at the ceiling, as if seeing through the walls. He hid under the blanket, frightened. At school, Peppa became the center of attention. The other girls mimicked her every move. They moved as one, pendants gleaming. Peppa's smile was hollow. George, watching from afar, felt he was losing her. When he approached, she looked past him, her gaze distant. In her eyes, he saw faceless figures moving in unison. That evening, Peppa went straight to the mirror. In her reflection, the tall, empty-eyed figure reappeared, slowly merging with her own. Her face became smooth, lifeless. George offered his dinosaur. She looked through him, not seeing him. Her focus remained on her reflection, now nearly identical to the figures. The room was spotless, the bunk bed still. The mirror showed a perfect but soulless space, and at its center, a figure that had once been Peppa, smiling an eerie, flawless smile. The mirror didn't crack, but what it reflected had changed forever. A sunny day lit up Peppa Pig's house. Peppa and George played in the garden, while Mummy Pig made lunch and Daddy Pig read his newspaper. Everything seemed normal, but something had changed. Daddy Pig was unusually quiet, focused, and unresponsive. At dinner, he ate slowly, didn't join the conversation, and avoided eye contact. Mummy Pig asked if he was okay. He only nodded. Afterward, instead of watching TV, he isolated himself in his room. Behind the door, an old radio hissed with strange, monotonous voices. The next day, he stopped going to work, spending all his time listening to the radio. His eyes looked empty, his movements sluggish. He claimed he was learning something important. The once lively house now felt cold and silent. One night, Peppa saw him leave the house under the moonlight. He stood still, staring at the sky, as if hearing something only he could understand. His eyes were wide but vacant. When she called out, he didn't react like her father. His touch was cold, his face emotionless. A headphone wire trailed from his pocket, connected to the old radio with faintly engraved symbols, a circle, a triangle, a square. When Peppa tried to hold his hand, he pulled away. She realized he was no longer her Daddy Pig. Something from the radio had taken him. He was a shell, guided by a distant voice, detached from his family and memories. The silence in their home wasn't ordinary. It was the echo of what remained of him, and that echo was the most terrifying sound Peppa had ever heard. On a rainy day, as puddles sparkled invitingly, Peppa and George played in their room. Sunlight filtered through the window onto their bunk bed, George below, Peppa above. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen, Daddy Pig with his newspaper in the living room. Everything seemed normal, but a subtle tension lingered. Peppa noticed George had gone unusually quiet. He stared blankly at the wall, his toy dinosaur forgotten on the floor. When Peppa suggested hide and seek, he just shook his head. At lunch, he moved slowly, barely ate, and only shrugged when asked if he was okay. That night, George stood silently by the window, watching the rain. Peppa felt a chill despite the warm room. When she tried to hug him, he pulled away, his skin cold. The next day, he grew more distant. No playing, no smiles, mechanical movements. Peppa, worried, told Susie Sheep, but Susie dismissed it as tiredness. Peppa knew better. Something inside George had changed. One night, Peppa awoke to a strange noise. George's bed was empty. She crept downstairs and found the front door ajar. Outside, in the rain, under a street lamp, stood George. He faced away, seemingly whispering to someone unseen. As Peppa approached, she saw a small black envelope in his hand. George turned. His eyes were pitch black, his face emotionless. He silently handed her the envelope. Inside was a single card showing a circle, triangle, and square. Without a word, George walked into the darkness. Peppa stood alone in the rain, the envelope trembling in her hands. The symbols on the card began to glow faintly. This wasn't a game. Something greater, darker had begun, and she was now a part of it. The rain fell harder, washing away the normal. Peppa's giggle was gone, replaced by quiet dread. Her home looked unfamiliar. Something inside her had shifted. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, only that it had already begun. The sun began to rise over the hills, painting the sky in soft pink and orange hues. In Peppa Pig's cozy home, everyone was still asleep. Peppa lay on the top bunk. George snored below. It seemed like a normal morning, full of play and laughter, but something had subtly shifted. Mummy Pig was making breakfast when she noticed Daddy Pig unusually silent. He sat staring into space, his cheerful snorts gone. "Daddy Pig, are you all right?" she asked. He blinked slowly, as if waking from a trance. His eyes looked empty and his forced smile felt wrong. As the day went on, the changes grew more obvious. Normally lively and playful, Daddy Pig now avoided conversation. He stopped playing with the kids, preferring to sit alone by the window. His movements grew slow and robotic, his voice flat. Peppa tried to cheer him up with puddle jumping, but he only waved her off, something he'd never done before. That evening, Daddy Pig didn't touch his dinner. He just stared at his plate. Mummy Pig grew concerned. "Are you sick, dear?" He shook his head but glanced toward the hallway mirror. For a moment, a flicker of fear crossed his face and then vanished. The next day, Peppa noticed him standing in front of that mirror for long stretches, but he wasn't looking at his reflection. He was staring through it, as if searching for something hidden. His hand touched the glass and Peppa heard a faint whisper, distant but chilling, as if coming from inside the mirror. It was cold and ancient, though she couldn't make out the words. Even George, usually fearless, began avoiding him. Something about Daddy Pig felt wrong. One night, Peppa awoke to a soft creak. In the moonlight, she saw him by the mirror, whispering in a voice that didn't sound like his. From the mirror came a response, growing louder, sharper. Terrified, Peppa tried to wake George, but he was fast asleep. She crept to the door. The whisper turned into a low, sinister laugh. Daddy Pig began to turn. His eyes glowed with a dim, unnatural light. A distorted, unfamiliar smile twisted his face. He reached toward Peppa, and she felt a freezing wave pass through her body. She stumbled back, heart racing. This wasn't her Daddy Pig. Something else had taken his place, something ancient, alien, from beyond understanding. Instinct told her to run. She scrambled to George, trying to shake him awake, but it was too late. Daddy Pig, or whatever he had become, was already standing in the doorway, that eerie smile widening. An ordinary morning in Peppa Pig's house began with the usual bustle. Sunlight streamed through the curtains into the room where Peppa and George were still asleep. George lay curled up on the bottom bunk, his blanket slightly askew, while Peppa, hugging her teddy, snored softly on the top bunk. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, and Daddy Pig sipped tea while reading the newspaper. Everything felt normal, calm and predictable, but the calm was deceptive, like a thin film over deep water. At breakfast, Peppa noticed Daddy Pig was unusually silent. He didn't joke or smile, his gaze fixed on something invisible. Mummy Pig tried to speak to him, but he only waved her off. It was completely unlike the cheerful Daddy Pig. A quiet unease began to settle over the house, like a creeping fog. Days passed, but Daddy Pig didn't improve. He became distant, stopped playing with Peppa and George, and his favorite chair sat empty. He spent hours by the window, staring at something no one else could see. Mummy Pig's attempts to reach him failed. His once warm, laughing eyes were now blank and lifeless. It was frightening. Peppa tried to reach him, calling his name, but he didn't respond. His eyes were fixed outside, on something not of their world. Mummy Pig grew more worried, her usual smile gone. Laughter vanished from the house, replaced by silence and tension. Even George grew quiet, sensing the change. Peppa talked to Susie Sheep and Pedro Pony at the playground, telling them about Daddy Pig. Susie shrugged. Her dad was odd sometimes, too. Pedro told her not to worry. Their casual responses made Peppa feel even more alone. No one took her seriously. That isolation was scarier than Daddy Pig's behavior. The world felt like it was shifting, and only she noticed. At night, Peppa couldn't sleep. Lying in her bunk, she listened to the silence. No snoring from Daddy Pig, only George's soft breathing. Suddenly, a strange whisper came from her parents' room. It wasn't words, just eerie sounds that raised goosebumps. She held her breath. Then, just as suddenly, the sound stopped, leaving a heavy, ringing silence and rising fear. The next morning, Mummy Pig had changed too. Her eyes were as empty as Daddy Pig's. Her actions robotic. She made breakfast but didn't eat, just placed food on plates as if programmed. Peppa tried to hug her, but she pulled away, cold and unfamiliar. Their home, once warm and safe, now felt like a trap full of shadows. Peppa looked at George, still asleep on the bottom bunk, peaceful and untouched by the strange new reality. She knew she had to protect him. But how do you fight something formless, something that silently takes away the people you love? Fear gripped her, but so did determination. It was a typical sunny morning. Peppa Pig and her family were having breakfast, laughing and chatting. Mummy Pig announced that after lunch, the kids would go play with their friends. Peppa cheered. They planned to play hide and seek. At the playground, Peppa and George noticed something strange behind the bushes, a worn-out doll. George was scared, but Peppa, entranced, walked closer. The doll looked odd. Its eyes seemed to shift slightly, and a faint, eerie smile appeared on its face. George insisted it looked at him, but Peppa ignored him. From that day, she began to change. She became quiet, distant, The doll was always by her side. Her friends noticed. When Susie Sheep asked her to play tag, Peppa refused. She started proposing strange games, unsettling, intense, like red light, green light, but with a terrifying twist. The one who moved was eliminated, forever. Far away at the edge of the forest, figures in red jumpsuits appeared. They stood still, silently observing. The children never noticed. One day, George tried to take the doll away. Peppa screamed at him. Her eyes flashed with a cold light. He ran away crying. Their parents grew increasingly worried, but Peppa wouldn't listen. George had nightmares. The doll stood over him, eyes glowing red. It started appearing around the house, always watching. In her room, Peppa whispered to it, as if hearing something back. When Mummy Pig tried to take the doll, Peppa resisted with unnatural strength. Her voice became flat, her movements puppet-like. One day, she gathered her friends for a quiet game. No one was allowed to make a sound. If they did, they lost. George accidentally squeaked. Peppa turned immediately. Her eyes were wide, cold. The doll tilted its head. George vanished. Everyone panicked, searching for him. Peppa stood still, holding the doll. Friends were terrified. Her parents didn't know what to do. She was alone now. In her room, hugging the doll, her face was expressionless. Finally, she walked outside. The red suede figures followed. She looked straight ahead, eyes hollow like the doll's. She raised her hand as if inviting someone to play. The sun set, painting the sky blood red. Silence fell. The game was over. On a sunny day, with birds chirping and flowers blooming, Peppa Pig and George played in the garden. Peppa was energetic, George chased butterflies. Mummy Pig watered the flower beds, and Daddy Pig read his newspaper in his favorite chair. Everything seemed normal, but something subtle, a faint wrongness, hung in the air. The next day, Peppa noticed her best friend Susie Sheep was unusually quiet. Normally cheerful and talkative, Susie now just sat on the swing, staring blankly. Her eyes were dull, her smile lifeless. Peppa tried to talk to her, but Susie barely reacted. As days passed, Susie withdrew further. She stopped playing, ignored her favorite games, and didn't laugh at Daddy Pig's jokes. Her movements slowed, her voice became a whisper. She often sat alone by an old well at the forest's edge. From it came a faint melody, which only Susie seemed to hear. One day, Peppa followed her. Susie approached the well, eyes locked on its dark water. The melody grew louder, sending a chill through Peppa. Susie slowly reached toward the well, her face twisted in longing and obsession. Peppa called out, but Susie didn't respond. She was completely entranced. Suddenly, mist rose from the well, surrounding her. The melody peaked in a jarring cacophony. When the mist cleared, Susie was gone. Only her bow remained at the well's edge. Shaking with fear, Peppa ran home. Mummy and Daddy Pig listened, but their faces showed disbelief. "You must have been dreaming," said Mummy Pig, though her voice wavered. Daddy Pig tried to reassure her, but kept glancing nervously at the window. That night, Peppa couldn't sleep. The same melody Susie had heard now echoed in her room. Quiet, but insistent. She slid off her bunk, careful not to wake George, and followed the sound to the window. Outside, in the darkness, stood a silhouette, tall, thin, with unnaturally long limbs and glowing, lifeless eyes. It reached out a hand. Peppa felt her body move toward the window against her will. The melody grew louder, filling the room. She couldn't resist. The figure smiled, a cold, ancient smile, empty of warmth, as dark as the night itself.